Hello, everybody. Welcome to another Thoughtfuel episode. I appreciate you taking time out of your busy schedule to join me today. Last week, we talked about how and why I find it's worth to modularize an Android application. If you haven't seen that episode already, I definitely recommend you checking it out. We're going to pivot a little bit this week, and instead, we're going to talk about unit tests, and actually why we don't unit test our activities. I'm going to give you 4 reasons why we don't unit test our activities and why we go the extra mile to do something different instead. So let's go ahead and talk about that today. So for those of you who have done Android development for a while, you know that activities lie at the heart of every app. It's one of the first things you see when you start it up, and it's one of the last things to disappear whenever you close it. So why do we go out of our way to omit these from unit tests? First and foremost, it's because this is incredibly difficult to unit test. All of the lifecycle functions that we have on our activity classes, they're actually not publicly available. They're internal, they're inaccessible, and they're really difficult to unit test. So to help us out with that, we turn to a library called RoboElectric. This is the major player in the field. They're pretty much the only library in the world that does exactly what they're meant to do. And really, this is its singular purpose, is to help us unit test our activities. So if anything were to happen to that library at some point, say maybe there was a bug, or maybe it's not being actively maintained anymore, we'd pretty much pigeonholed ourselves into using it to support some of the backbone operations of our unit tests, which that puts us in a difficult situation, and we really don't want to be there. So that's one reason why I don't really like to use RoboElectric, even though it's a great library for what it is. The way it works is it mocks the entire life cycle. So all of those functions that we can't directly call inside of our class because they're internal, we basically say to RoboElectric, you need to call those for us. And in the event of calling those, it actually mocks out all of the parent class functionality, so we don't run into any surprises whenever it comes time for us to run our test on our own activities. The second reason is actually rather closely tied to the first reason. Whenever we have RoboElectric doing so much work for us behind the scenes, obviously that's going to add a bit of overhead, but in this case, it's a ton of overhead. RoboElectric tests are several orders of magnitude slower than standard JUnit tests. I could run several hundred JUnit tests in the time that it would take me to run, say, 10 or 20 standard RoboElectric tests. The third reason is more of an application architecture discussion. So instead of having activities doing a bunch of work for us, I typically recommend that we use an MVC style architecture, which allows us to separate the logic that normally would have gone inside of the activity out into controllers and view models. So we're used to seeing functions like onCreate, onDestroy, and other lifecycle functions going on inside of an activity. I typically take those and put them inside of a controller, and that's where all my business logic lives. So I would have an onCreate, an onDestroy, and other lifecycle functions inside of my controller, and I simply say to the activity that it needs to be the one calling the functions on the controller. So now, there's really nothing that it does except call the reciprocating functions on the controller. And then likewise, if there's anything view related, I create a view model and then have the controller call those things on the view model. So now I have a very highly testable functionality in my application because all of it goes from my controller and the view model instead of living inside of the activity. Now, this architecture that I'm talking about, I've discussed in detail in an article, and I'll have that down in the link below. The fourth and final reason is really to realize what activities are there for. So if we adopt an MVC style architecture or something else that allows us to extract all of that logic outside of the activity, really we don't have a lot to unit test at this point. In fact, most of what we're doing at this point is just calling something else. And we can do that with smoke testing, manual testing, UI testing. Really, if you do something wrong, like say to forget to call onCreate on your controller, it's going to be pretty obvious pretty quick that something's broken. So at this point, I really just consider the activity to be the life cycle. The controllers are the things that does all of the work for us and are really the things that should be unit tested. Similarly with the view model. The view model does all of the view related work, and we can test that separately as well because it's our own class. Thank you for joining me for this Thoughtfuel episode. I hope you found it insightful. If you haven't subscribed or hit the bell yet, I definitely recommend you do that. I have new content every week, Monday at noon, all related to Android development. We have a new topic every single week, and I hope that you'll join us again next week for another episode of Thoughtfuel. Thank you, and happy coding.